did anyone do the additional readings, the 10 reasons for Vatican II or the Vatican I documents?
Vatican II has always been something that you saw in a document somewhere, but this is really opening my eyes to the level of effort and the importance of the Vatican II documents. And I had no idea that they were so in depth. Reading the difference between Vatican I, which was sort of a truncated council, to Vatican II, and the overarching effort that they made to affect change is really amazing. This is like opening my eyes. I had no idea, even though I went to Catholic school, that there was this much involved, you know, even in the lines of text for each conference.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's interesting. I like that they're laying it out by, they, out of, I don't know, 27,000 lines of doctrine they laid out. I really appreciate that the book is only going to go through.
Here is volume 1. And
Yeah.
it's 1,036 pages. Volume 2 is a smaller paperback, sort of mass market size, but it's
Tiny print.
920 pages. So it's an enormous amount. Our book sort of tries to distill it down into highlights and some of the major justifications.
And I think the book itself, you know, beyond the introduction to the book itself, is an introduction to the documents of Vatican II. I mean, I had no idea that it was broken up into these several groups.
Right.
And the fact that it was a relief when they said, well, we're going to focus on 20 passages. I go, God, this book doesn't seem thick enough to handle more of that. But I think from this point on, for further in-depth looks into it, this is a great stepping stone to that. I mean, like the way it's written, it seems very knowledgeable. And the history is laid out in the introduction was really helpful, because like I'm zero knowledge of Vatican II beyond what I told you last week.
I have this one that's the 16 documents of Vatican II.
Oops.
But, and then and it says with commentaries by the Council Fathers. And this part of it at the end is commentaries on the different documents.
Pope John the 23rd's announcement of a Vatican, of an ecumenical council took everyone by surprise. Partly because he was just kind of expected to be around a little while and then die. And partly because in the period between the Council of Trent, and especially in the second half of the 19th century, up until Pope John the 23rd, and particularly under the First Vatican Council and then under Pius XII, the power of the papacy, or the role of the Pope within Catholicism, had grown tremendously, from being something of a collegial figure to being, you know, sort of the authoritarian figure within Catholicism, or the ultimate authority. And ultimate authority isn't exactly right. Probably authoritarian figure, the absolute authority within Catholicism, so that the Pope's pronouncements were law. And so given that, there didn't seem to be much need for ecumenical councils anymore. since one had Pope. And yet Pope John 23rd called for an ecumenical council, and everybody saw it as a source of hope, regardless of position or regardless of expectation. For many, the council was looked to as a source of change and reform. And for others, it was looked to as a source of preserving the faith and really continuing along the same course. And so the authors discuss sort of what saved the council from failure.
What I read in the introduction, what saved the council from failure, even though a lot of, I guess there was a presumption that it would fail. And the author lines them out pretty well, as first, Pope John the 23rd offered a remarkable address at the opening mass of the council. And the second was the representation, on the consular commissions was much different than it had been in the past. And third, for many of the bishops, the council provided a remarkable opportunity for their own ongoing education. And this is, especially the third was particularly surprising to me, that the bishops would find this as an opportunity to expand their knowledge of all aspects of.
It's because they were seated by seniority rather than geographically. So you were seated with people unfamiliar to you, and therefore, in some form, had to exchange at least talk to them and exchange ideas with them, as opposed to being with people who were familiar to you. And, so in some sense, there's going to be a certain similarity and therefore a certain no need to communicate anything.
It's also interesting that Vatican II, there's sort of an old school, new school factions sort of setup, you see. And even in the approval of the different doctrines and the different documents that are going to be produced, is interesting to see in the introduction that because of the seating of the bishops and the cardinals, and even the way they were boarding each other, that they were being boarded, that even though the whole thing was conducted in Latin without translators, all these prelates and priests and bishops had an opportunity to intermingle with each other and change ideas from their perspectives. And that's amazing to me. If only things work that way today in a lot of other places, we'd probably be far better off than we are now. I think that the across the board openness to change of ideas is really remarkable for the time that occurred.
Mm-hmm. Pope John the 23rd convened the Vatican II with a document, an Apostolic Constitution called Humanae Salutis, which means salvation of humankind. It's readily available on the Vatican website. And in it, Pope John basically lays out the reasons for convening Vatican II. One of them is that in the secular world boasts of its technical and scientific conquests, but also bears the effects of a temporal order that some have wanted to reorganize by excluding God. So that's one reason. He also talks about, while distrustful souls see nothing but darkness falling upon the face of the earth, We prefer to restate our confidence in our Savior, who has not left the world he redeemed. He also argues that given the crisis of secular society, given the increasingly obvious limitations of the advance of science, so the science had brought us Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not a great achievement. Science was bringing us nuclear weapons which threatened to destroy life on Earth. Clearly, there were problems with progress. Decolonization was happening. Enormous social changes were happening. And he argued that that was leading people to seek greater spirituality, to recognize the limitations of material. Then he also argued that in this context, the church was in a position to contribute more effectively to the solution of the problems of the modern age. And so he saw the Second Vatican Council as, he put it, a continuation of a series of 20 great councils, which throughout the centuries have been a real heavenly providence for the increase of grace and of Christian progress. And then he also saw Vatican II as an opportunity to begin to work toward the unity of all Christians. That's a good place, I think, to begin sort of a discussion of Vatican II, of its goals, and sort of to kind of help us to appreciate the complexity of the issues. So there are a number of questions that we can address that I've discussed. So the first question reads, from Humani Salutis, a world that boasts of its technical and scientific conquest, but also bears the effects of a temporal order that some have wanted to reorganize by excluding God. So the questions are, what is your sense of how Vatican II hoped to address the exclusion of God? And what contemporary solutions do Catholics offer for addressing this exclusion of God?
I mean, hasn't Vatican II, since its conclusion, isn't one of the major discussions in the church is how do we address relativism as opposed to the teachings of Vatican II? How do we take relativism out of the picture and talk about the not the teachings of Christ, but how do we make the liturgy and life place, the church community, teaching of the church, and present them as an argument against relativism. I mean, and is relativism necessarily all bad?
I think the starting point is I think, sort of what is relativism? And I think relativism is sort of a difficult term to explain. I mean, there's a way in which, unfortunately, we're probably all relativists, and probably everybody has always been, to some degree, a relativist. Well, one form of relativism is hypocrisy, that what's good for me is good for me, and I don't care about you.
And that's probably the point I'm making. That's, I guess,
They're all relative. But the one of what's good for me is good for me.
But in some ways, the broader issue, we can identify it as relativism, but I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that relativism actually is the best term. So the question really is one of how to relate to the surrounding, especially secular culture. And
because I have it on through Kindle, I don't have a page number. But in chapter 1, it talks about how we are invited, not just Christians, but all humanity is invited to this high calling of being in service to one another. And it applies to all people of goodwill in whose hearts grace is active invisibly. The vocation of humanity will be realized only when all people learn to live together in self-transcending love. And I think that speaks to the secular world as well. Everybody wants to have a better world. Or at least I look at everybody wanting it. Of course, we see what's happening today, but I think the Catholic Church has or had the best capability, if it's done, I was going to say right, but what's right? To include all humanity in this effort and to be an example of this. And I think with our social justice teaching and our teachings, Christ's teachings of peace, we can do it on a bigger scale.
Right. Right. So, yeah, the mission of Vatican II was to energize, revitalize the church, not only the clergy, but the laity, to increase participation of the laity and to make the church an image of Christ in the world that would draw people to the message of the gospel. Well, so to begin with, the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth. This is chapter 5, verse 1 of Matthew. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and then the Sermon on the Mount follows. You know, what's significant about that is that Matthew is drawing on Matthew is using typology here. And he's implicitly presenting Jesus as the new Moses, as the prophet like Moses that God had promised. And so there's the Sermon on the Mount corresponds in many ways to Moses receiving the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. So the significant difference is that Moses goes up to the mountain to hear God, to communicate with God. Jesus goes up to the mountain to communicate with his followers or the crowd because he is God. He's the Son of God. So that's a significant difference. He then comes down he then delivers the Sermon on the Mount. Then in chapter 8, he comes down from the mountain. In verse 1, it says, when he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to the people. The significance of that, does everybody know about leprosy in the Old Covenant?
Yes.
In the old covenant? No,
Mhm.
other than they were excluded.
Right, they were excluded. So leprosy in the Bible is not Hansen's disease, which is what we know as leprosy. That was very rare in the Middle East. Leprosy is any of a wide range of skin maladies, including something like severe acne.
Oh, gosh.
So leprosy is also the worst thing that can possibly happen to a human being. You're segregated from society. You have to wear a sign. You have to walk around yelling. If you see anybody or are in danger of approaching anybody, you have to yell, unclean, unclean.
Right.
So you become completely isolated. Leprosy is considered to be ritually defiling. So if a leper touches you, you become unclean.
Mm-hmm.
In order to become clean, there's a cleansing ceremony, and for a leper to become unclean, they have to go to a priest and be certified as unclean, which is why Jesus tells the person to tell no one, go to the priest and then present the offering so that you'll be readmitted back into society. So what is the point of all of this? You become unclean if even a leper crosses your shadow. So what does Jesus do? He touches the leper, right?
Which would, yes,
And-
under the beliefs at the time would make him unclean also.
Right, so what is Matthew saying by recording that? What is his theological statement?
That Jesus is a purifier. He can cleanse the unclean without becoming unclean himself.
Right, but he's saying more than that. He's also making a general theological proposition.
That perhaps these people aren't unclean in the eyes of God.
That's true, but what else?
Oh, I'm reaching now.
Does anyone have any idea?
Well, maybe he was like say, like he always would say, you should, what is really clean and what is really not clean, or who can see and who can't see. He was always trying to point out the injustices, I think, of the way the culture was set up.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's true. So, but the point of the healing is that in Mosaic law, when the unclean touches the clean, or the unholy touches the holy, the clean becomes unclean and the holy unholy. Jesus' miracle tells us that when the holy touches the unholy becomes holy.
Oh,
And when the clean touches the unclean becomes clean.
so the opposite.
He reversed the polarity.
He reverses the polarity, but the important point is that that is the mission of the church.
Hmm.
Which in many ways, I think, provides context for how we should look, at secular society. So, I mean, it's as if Christians expect that secular society is going to be Christian, is Christian, should be Christian, must be Christian. But that's absurd. It's the responsibility of the church to bring the gospel to those who are not believers. And so, I mean, in some ways, then the question becomes how to do that. And ultimately, I mean, I think that there's general agreement among all Catholics and all Christians that that is the mission of the church. But then it becomes a question of how do we do that? So Pope John the 23rd talked about removing God, reorganize by excluding God. So then what do we do to include God? And here we have a profound division. So it's a question of a secular society or of a secular culture which seeks to exclude God, and in many ways, always has sought to exclude God.
So when you said exclude God, are you talking about the text to exclude God, or?
I'm talking about
Our prayer and
I'm talking about secular society that ignores God, denies the existence of God, affirms the existence of God in a very
those are atheists.
soft way.
They're not.
Atheists, agnostics, lapsed Christians. I mean, there are a lot of people, yeah.
Well, if we are the hands and feet of Jesus, if we extend the love of God to others, I think that's a great way to evangelize.
Right. What about the other position, the sort of conservative position, the one that well, so for example, you frequently hear that God is excluded and so he needs to be put back. So for example, we have the movement to restore prayer in public schools. What about that?
That would be to include God rather than exclude God.
Right, they've excluded.
Right, the point is that that's the presented as a solution to the problem. We bring back.
It's not the solution.
Mhm.
Well, I think when it comes to the secular, that we need to, God comes to people through many different avenues. I mean, there's Christianity, But God, also comes to people through Islam and Judaism and Asian religions. And I think we as the Christian society need to be more open to how God is brought into the secular world. To
Mhm.
say, it doesn't have to, we don't have to, let's bring Christmas back to school. We don't have to do it that way, but we could offer, prayers of any faith could be offered in the public arena
Right.
and
Mhm.
accepted, hopefully.
Right.
So I guess being wider.
Yeah, that's one of the significant changes of Vatican II, where
Mhm.
it would be useful, it would be good for everyone to read the Vatican I documents. There's only 23 pages. And even to quickly compare them with the previous ecumenical council, which is Trent, the tone is starkly different.
Mhm.
In some sense, very harsh and very sort of authoritarian, very
Dualistic?
dualistic. In what sense?
Dualistic meaning our way is the right way and we don't recognize.
Yeah, very, very much
other
so.
way.
Right. So, right. So the Catholic Church is the ultimate and only repository of faith, as opposed to the view that all faiths, to some extent, reflect and point to God. They
Yes.
simply do so to different degrees. And so all people of faith presumably can unite, which is another question. So another goal of Vatican II was to make even more alive in our separated brethren the desire for the hope for return to unity and to smooth the way to it. So the questions are, to what extent do you think Vatican II achieved this goal? And what are the issues that promote or impede unity?
But there was a time not too long ago when, Catholics couldn't, I believe, couldn't go to Protestant churches. And the Catholic way was the only way. I think that's what it said in the Vatican I
Mhm,
notes. And that's really changed. That's really opened up.
mhm, right.
Oh, then there's
Yeah.
marriage.
When I was a kid, the notion was that you can only marry a Catholic and anything else is just completely unacceptable.
Mhm.
Right.
So the issue of ecumenism and unity with our separated brethren is in many ways a really complex and difficult one, which has there's been some change. It's acceptable to attend the services and mass of other denominations. It's not acceptable to take communion except in the Greek Orthodox Church.
Who says it's not acceptable to take communion at another church?
The church does its basic foundational Catholic teaching.
Okay.
It's in fact, it's a sin
Okay.
because it's failing to discern the body of Christ.
I can understand that. I mean, I would not feel comfortable taking communion at another faith church because they just don't look at it the same way we do. Okay.
The Eucharist is offered in all of the pre-Reformation is the center of the Mass
Right.
in all of the pre-Reformation churches.
What's a pre-Reclamation church?
Reformation.
What's a
Reformation.
pre-Reformation church?
It's the
Luther.
Catholic Church, it's the Greek Orthodox Church, it's the five
Okay,
Eastern Oriental Orthodox churches.
okay.
It's the Nestorian Church.
And
So
it-
the 8 churches
Mhm.
are pre-Reformation churches. Communion is offered in the Lutheran Church, but there's a different theology of, although Christ is said to be present in body, soul, spirit, and divinity, the underlying theology is sharply different from the pre-Reformation churches.
Right. It's nothing like walking into the back door of a Lutheran church and see the blood of Christ being thrown out in the garden. That's a real shocker.
Right, yeah,
Yeah, so-
but it is, the blood of Christ. It's simply
Right.
that the context of the Mass and the Lutheranism has this doctrine of consubstantiation rather than transubstantiation.
Mhm.
And the Mass is not a sacrifice. So it's really simply very different.
Yes.
And then,
To answer your question, to what extent do I think Vatican II achieved this goal of smoothing the way to unity? During the council, they invited people from different churches, and they had Jewish representation. They had Lutherans there who were even able to speak and submit information,
mhm,
and Episcopals and well, I don't know about the Baptists, the Methodists. So there was a great feeling in the beginning of working together. There's been continued dialogue with Lutherans and with the Jewish leadership.
mhm,
And so I think that's wonderful. And I see Pope Francis doing the same thing. He's trying to bring that back again. Some of it got shelved in the dualism of some of our leadership, but
mhm.
Pope Francis is trying to recreate that unity that was alive during the council.
Mhm. Yeah, progress is, there's been progress, although it's been very, very slow. And there's been some progress with Lutherans. There's a really good series of books called Lutherans, and it's either called Lutherans and Catholics in Dialogue or Catholics and Lutherans in Dialogue. But it examines, so it's a sort of joint effort by Lutheran and Catholic theologians or clergy or that
When we get
discusses.
to that later part, when we are studying the document about the other separated churches and the unity.
Yeah, we can. Although the series is post-Vatican II. What I really wanted to stress here is that progress has been made, but it's slow. There has been dialogue, but it has been still in many ways limited. I mean, there's been the change in the liturgy was adopted in some cases in the Anglican Church and other Protestant liturgical churches. That's real progress. There's been, especially more recently, some dialogue between Pope Francis and the Greek Orthodox Church. Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew are very close friends. But there's also a great deal of work to be done and some serious issues, especially with the degree to which unity is possible with evangelical fundamentalists. So the way unity usually works is that there's a Greek word, adiaphora, which means a non-essential difference. And so you have to agree on a significant body of something, and then agree that a significant body of something else is adiaphora, non-essential, and then leave essential differences to, have to be fairly minor. Then you can have some measure of unity. But we're a long way away from that.
Those type of disagreements will always be, I think. But those type of whether they bless the wine and or change the wine and the bread into the body and blood of Jesus Christ, that may never change in other churches. But I'm thinking if we keep God out of it, like we talked about earlier, that maybe we can see in other religions the goodness that the particular religion brings in their church. That we can see that this person is good like Christ is, and relate and relate in that way. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, at an individual level, it certainly does.
But there's more of them, so it's not just going to be one person here and one person there, but sometimes an entire community.
Well, that's the problem. Then it becomes a structure. And the hard thing is that if the church is called to imitate Christ in the world, there are numerous imitations.
Well, imitation sounds like fake.
What?
When you use the word imitation, you're saying it's fake?
I'm not using it. I'm using it in the sense of one who imitates or professes to imitate Christ.
Okay, to be like him. Yes.
So the problem is that there are numerous imitations of Christ, and many of them are really horrible imitations of Christ. They're really, one can argue, anti-imitations. And so the problem is that for secular society, those imitations become singled out as Christianity. So, for many people in secular society, Christians are the people who have worked very, very hard to prolong the pandemic by refusing to wear masks, by trying to spread the virus to other people, to trying to maximize deaths as much as possible. And you can sort of go on. There are those, that crazy fringe group that protested at the funerals of American soldiers because I don't even remember why they were protesting. But Christians get tagged all together with the worst practices of some. And the worst practices, QAnon, for example, is in many ways a Christian phenomenon. It's largely believed by Christians. The Tea Party, which is, was a political movement founded by Christians, is based on the philosophical principles of Friedrich Nietzsche and Ayn Rand, both of whom were egotistical atheists. So, in that sense, if Christianity is to to provide a light to the world, it's unfortunately often only providing darkness.
Yeah, but on the other hand, so I have to give an example. Over the last 25 or 30 years, I've been involved a lot with the poor, the homeless, etc.
Mhm.
There's a group that I got involved with here, Kenmore Bothell Interfaith Group, I think is what it is. And it is made up of all different kinds of faiths in the Bothell, Kenmore area. And we have been gathered together as a group, and we have helped the overnight shelters through the wintertime, different kinds of help meals, etc. And we've been doing this for like 5 or 6 years, and we never bring the individual faith part in there, and we're serving so many people. Been so impressed with how the Sikhs and the Jewish people and the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Catholics, we've all gotten together and have served our community really well, and not brought up all of the other parts that are there. We've even had meetings where we've explained what our different faiths center is about and stuff. So there is that out there. If
Right.
we use that as a beginning base
But
to move from, then we could do
the-
it.
And
go ahead, Michelle.
will we be studying chapter 20 in this book?
Yeah,
Because it starts out with the Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions, the world religions.
mhm.
And then it goes on to explain more. And I think that if the Catholic Church can keep that outlook, that can help with unifying people again, not rejecting their goodness at which God calls us to be to each other.
Mhm. That's a goal, but the irony in many ways is that it's sort of much easier to do it with people of other faith traditions, which is to say Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, than it is with other Christians. Since
Isn't
we
that
always
sad?
since we always end up having theological and other disagreements, and those disagreements tend to be very intense. But the point of all of this, I think, simply I wanted to emphasize that unity is hard. And although I agree with you, Larry, I mean, there's an enormous amount of work that both can be done together and is being done together, especially and in many ways, even among evangelical fundamentalists, it sort of began, especially the younger generation of evangelicals, it's sort of beginning to change as younger evangelicals are more concerned about the environment, for example, and recognizing that there's a significant, severe environmental crisis that needs to be dealt with by people of faith that are, becoming more active in the struggle against racism and the recognition of, the enormous extent of human poverty, both throughout the world and in our own country. So there is a basis of hope, but progress is very, very slow. Pope John the 23rd emphasized continuity with the ecumenical councils
Before,
And,
could I ask one question?
uh-huh,
Relating back to what we were just talking about and looking at the documents, disseminated by Vatican II, 16 significant ones. We're talking about external relations, which would fall under, I guess, one of the three declarations.
mhm.
Without having read them yet, what was the perspective of Vatican II? How did it see the church's relation with, with the external world? It breaks it up here, non-Christian religions and the Jews, ecumenism, and and others, religious liberty, which was a big thing in the 60s. What was the slant? How were they seeing themselves move into the next, however long, to the next Vatican Council? What did they see the role of the church in these external relations?
The role of the church is to recognize that all or to support religious liberty, to recognize that all faiths reflect God in some way and seek the divine in some way. And that particularly the mission of the church in the world and in the secular world is to evangelize especially through example, through particularly by following Catholic social teaching, by living out a gospel of love, by reflecting Christ in the world and evangelizing in that way.
Well, I ask it because, was there a change in perspective? When I was growing up, everyone who wasn't baptized a Catholic was considered a pagan unless they were Jews. In which case, if they were Jews, they were the ones who murdered Christ. So, that doesn't play anymore. But did Vatican II have a role in adjusting Catholic attitudes towards other religions?
A significant role, yeah. It marked a turning point.
That's what I found. So one of the many things I found so exciting about Vatican II was that they were doing away with that attitude,
Mhm.
wanting to promote being able to see the reflection of God in other religions and respectfully.
I guess what I'm asking is this something that sprang from Vatican II, or is this something like other things that came to us through Vatican II that had been sort of percolating in the years prior to, in the late 50s? And is this something is this change that was coming, and John 23rd embraced it, got it into Vatican II? Or it's brand new thing?
No, it's really not a brand new thing, although the basic problem is that there has been really a struggle within the church from the time of the French Revolution onward about the direction of the church and whether the church, precisely over these issues, the relationship of the church to secular culture, relationship of the church to secular movements, the relationship of the church to, you know, sort of social changes. The shape of the liturgy, the role of the laity in the church, the relationship to other faith groups, other religions, the relationship of the church to indigenous peoples and people of color, the relationship of the church to the environment, you know, the way in which the Bible should be interpreted. All of those are, you know, have been you know, sort of issues for
Barry, on
250 years.
2, it says that Pope Pius XII undertook a series, and this is in the 50s, like you mentioned, series of initiatives that prepared the way for the more substantial reforms that would follow at Vatican II. So you're right in thinking that these did start in the 50s and maybe even before, right, Ron?
Yeah, many started much before.
Yeah,
And-
1909.
And also remember that the Catholic tradition tends to be very, in some sense, diverse. You know, so
Well, yeah, and I saw that, you know, I was just wondering. Yeah, I guess, you know, I understand that there was a lot of adjustment in churches, in the Catholic Church thinking post World War II because of the incredible social upheaval, the number of people killed, and the treatment of the Jews. And so I was just curious as to how fast this had been moving forward, or was Vatican II this completely radical reevaluation of the way it dealt with the outside world.
I mean, almost all of the currents, you know, underlying Vatican II were, you know, had been going on for a while. There's a basic pattern throughout the history of the church that in periods of crisis, in periods of corruption, in periods of stagnation, and in periods of decline, from some part of the church, there's been a renewal. And, you know, frequently it's come from parish clergy. So frequently it's also come from the laity. But in each time it's happened, it's revived the church in a major way. You know, so we saw, you know, in response to the Industrial Revolution, I mean, you know, many, you know, part of Catholicism simply condemned the Industrial Revolution as, you know, exploitative, unacceptable, whatever. And, you know, so certainly with the recognition of the evils of industrialization, but kind of imagining that we can go back to some other state, we'll become rural again. Whereas, particularly in this case, the laity decided that this is just a great opportunity for evangelizing in the midst of this oppression. We can bring God, we can alleviate conditions, we can you know, form Catholic labor unions, we can become activists. And you know, so that was a real driving force in Catholicism. In South America, liberation theology was, you know, of an enormous significance in revitalizing the church, which today is growing very rapidly. unlike the church in the United States. So, I mean, there's been this, kind of constant dialectic, there's this sort of struggle between the two factions throughout the post-French Revolution era. So remember in the French Revolution, the church was opposed to democratic government. The official church, very, very slow to endorse change.
So I guess the question is how significant, and I suspect as we look at these documents and these particular passages from Vatican II, that we'll learn more about this, but overall, how significant was it, or was it just swept along in a sea change? These changes were inevitable, or would they have taken significantly longer time to have been put into effect? I'm trying to get an idea of, because when I was a little kid during Vatican II, there was this great enthusiasm in my parish community for Vatican II. And it was all thrown onto Pope John the 23rd.
Mhm.
The JFK of the Catholic Church at that time. And I could see things moving along, and that's the way things always are. Is nothing. Things seldom start with an earthquake. They usually start with a rumble or a small wave, and then proceed to change. And I'm just wondering, where would we be now without Vatican II? How would we see the church, which is a sort of a what if situation, but I find myself asking that question as we address this.
Mhm. That's a good question. I mean, it's certainly clear that Pope John the 23rd played an enormous role in pushing forward Vatican II. It's also true that, and in small ways, I mean, in some ways, I think you could say he was a political operator in a good sense. I mean, probably nobody is familiar with him as a religious leader, but kind of like St. Basil the Great, who was a very astute political operator in a
Smooth talker.
in a very good way.
Yes.
So in some ways, Pope John the 23rd, was like that, and some evidence of it, from his opening address, from also seating people by seniority and not geographically. That was a major, so really seemingly minor, insignificant change, but one that is really, in many ways, earth-shattering. It really breaks down
That's fascinating to read.
breaks down walls.
Very interesting.
And then for the 10 conciliar commissions, making them ideologically and geographically balanced, that was also a change. And so those interventions are essential. I mean, all of these currents really, sort of always have been of long standing within Catholicism, sort of liturgical conservatism versus calls for liturgical reform, greater participation of the clergy versus of the laity versus less participation of the laity, open access to the Bible. I mean, that every Catholic should read the Bible versus no Catholic should read the Bible. Scholars in the pre-Vatican II world, Catholic scholars largely related to one another and very little to non-Catholic scholars. Vatican II changed that. Both, for good, and I mean, it had some negative effects, which probably aren't, a great deal of interest other than to, sort of some of us, but yeah, so, I mean, all of those currents had been competing over, the whole, for at least the last 80 years or so before Vatican II. And for the most part, the forces of conservatism tended to have the upper hand, but there were periods in which they weren't. And so with Pope John the 23rd, the forces of, especially given that he was expected to not do anything and largely just be around a few years and then die,
Placeholder.
that he did represent the force of change. I remember when Pope Pius XII died, my father was really hoping for a progressive change in the church. And when he found out that Pope John the 23rd had become Pope, he was just ecstatic. He was really excited about the future of Catholicism. And unfortunately, he died about 6 months after Pope John the 23rd became Pope. So he never got to see Vatican II, but he really would have been enormously excited by it. We're out of time.
Oh,
Okay,
what are we
yeah,
reading?
so chapter 1 next week.
Chapter one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We read it.
Through baptism, we are implanted in the Paschal mystery.